The first kind of loop is a while loop. So a while loop is used to repeat a group of code until a condition is met, until a conditional expression evaluates to true. It looks very similar to an if statement, where we have the words if, then we have our conditional, and then we have our end. In an if statement, we hit this code, we check to see if the conditional is true or false. If it's true, we execute the code inside. If it's not, we skip over it and continue. In a while loop, it's very similar, where instead of an if keyword, we have a while keyword. We're still going to execute the code. We hit this conditional. It's still checking to see if it's true or false. If it's true, it executes the code inside, and then it's going to go back up and recheck the conditional. If it's still true, it executes code inside, goes back up, rechecks the conditional, and keeps going over and over and over again until our conditional evaluates to false. So a while loop can be used in all looping situations. The conditional expression contains what's called a loop control variable. And that variable, we need three things. That variable needs to be initialized before the loop. We need some initial value stored in that variable. It's going to be tested in our conditional expression. That helps indicate when we're going to stop looping. And then a very key piece is it needs to be modified in the code block. It needs to be modified somewhere in here so that when we go back up and recheck our conditional, our loop control variable contains a different number. So this answer might be still true, but it also might be false. And then it also is possible to have more than one loop control variable. So here's a very basic example of a while loop and the syntax that we have. So first things first, you see variable equals initial value. So here's my initialization. And this can happen anywhere in the code as long as it's before the while loop. And then I have while and then my conditional expression. So here's where I am testing the variable, such as variable greater than 0, variable less than 0. Something that indicates when I want to keep going. Then inside my loop here, you can see I have it modified. It's not always at the end of the loop. A lot of times it is though. But somewhere we need to modify our variable inside of this code so that when I go back up and I recheck my conditional expression, it might be different. So there are common errors with writing loops that I want to highlight. So one of these errors might be with our initialization. Our initialization identifies if we're going to enter the loop or not. It identifies if we're going to execute it 0 times or at least once. Okay? So a lot of times we want it to at least enter the loop at least once. But also it just depends. So make sure you guys know what your initial value is going to be, because that's going to affect whether or not you enter the loop. The second error is testing our variable. So this is our conditional expression. Identifies when we're going to keep going, when we're going to stop. So there's going to be, once again, you'll have practice writing your conditional expressions. With loops though they're a little bit more complicated because the code is just more complicated because you have this looping iteration. Okay? I had an issue writing while loop right before creating this video. Okay? So we might have issues with how we're testing our loop control variable. It might be incorrect. And then lastly, a common error is forgetting to modify the loop control variable inside of our loop body, resulting in an infinite loop. And once again, if you ever run into an infinite loop, if you ever want to stop your program early, you would just say press Control C. Okay, so let's look at an example of a while loop. So here's the while loop I was writing. I had issues with it. This is the third time I've created this video because I was trying to figure out my conditional expression. So if we step through this code, essentially what we're doing is we're asking the user to enter in a positive even integer. Then I'm checking to see if it's valid. So I'm writing a conditional statement that checks to see if it's valid. So it's invalid if a is less than 0 or if it's not an integer. And so here is checking to see if it's valid. If it's not valid, if this is true, I'm going to re-ask the user for an integer. If it was an if statement, I would only re-ask them once. A while loop though, once the user re-enters in their number, it's going to go back and recheck this to make sure that the new number is correct. So let's step through this with our debugging just to see how our code works. So first things first, enter in a positive even integer. So 3. 3 is a positive number, but it's not even. So here's my first while conditional. So I'm checking to see if it's less than 0 or if it's not an integer. So as long as one of these is true, the whole thing is true. So I step inside. So this is true. So that means I'm re-asking the user to enter in an integer. So let's say I ask them to enter in -7. Okay, so MATLAB shows that we've reached the end, but what's really happening is that we are going to go back up and recheck our conditional. So A now stores a value of 7, or -7. So now A is less than 0, and it's also not an integer. So I'm going to go back inside and re-execute the code inside. I'm going to re-ask the user for another integer. So this time I'll do 5. So now A is 5. 5 is positive, it's greater than 0, but it's still not even. So I gotta go back in and re-execute the code inside. And I keep going until I hit a positive even number. So here now A is 6. 6 is positive. 6 is an integer. So now this whole thing is false. And I'm done. And I've exited. So if we see this fast, it looks like this. So 9, -15, -8, -65, 40, 425, 500. So note it kept asking me over and over and over again, and it stopped when I finally entered in a positive even integer. If A was correct right away, I would have gone through this code 0 times. I would have looped 0 times. So here we can see our while loop changes depending on how many times the user enters in an incorrect value. But note the key piece is they enter in a value. Here's my initialization. Here's where I'm testing it. And here's my modification. So I have all of the key pieces where this code is going to keep repeating over and over and over again until this conditional is false.